Hello everyone, today we're just going to look at few of the most awkward losses from a world champion. And that champion is none other than Viswanathan Anand. Now I'm very quickly going to insert some disclaimer that this is not made to jeer Viswanathan Anand. Heck, he's one of the most influential champion there is, as people in Asia started playing chess more when he became a champion, and also due to his accolades and also his playing style that granted him a nickname of Tiger from Madras. This video is to show that even top grandmasters in the world can blunder what can be considered as a simple tactic. This is something I believe everyone has experienced as well at least once in their career, and I just want to highlight some of these moments in this video. So without further ado, let's just jump ahead to the game played between Viswanathan Anand and Michael Adams, played in London Chess Classics 2012. I believe I've covered this one game in one of my videos already, but in essence in this position, White chose to simplify the position with knight takes on e5. As he felt there's nothing to fight for in this position, he continues with queen to e3, targeting this pawn on c5 basically. And after, let's say, bishop to e2 and rook to d8, we see more pieces come off the board. But after bishop to c4, which seems normal because he wants to exchange pieces, after bishop takes c4, rook to c4, rook to b2, rook to b4, and perhaps black will find a draw here. And he's fine with that because he's particularly up a pawn here. He misses a tactic that black can do in this position, and that is not bishop takes on c4. Now, because the rook is already cut from the reinforcement of the first rank, Mickey Adam in this position finds queen to d1, and it's actually the best move in this position. The idea is that to play rook to a1 and to checkmate in the back rank. Notice the light squares are all covered by the light squared bishop, and therefore there's no way that he can actually win this. For example, bishop takes on e6, simply rook to a1, and this is going to be checkmate in light squares. There's no way that the white king can escape. And it does seem like bishop to f1 can help the position for a bit, especially if the rook is now open to the first rank. And in this position, if black plays rook to a1, it does seem like queen to d3 might have helped, because now the queen can't take f1, probably is forced to take on d3, and this position probably white is barely holding on, but black doesn't have to play rook to a1. In this position, bishop to h3 is what is played in the game as well, deflecting the king. The king will have to move to one of the square, take the pawn here, the bishop, then the bishop on f1 will be lost. This is the same as checkmate. He can't travel to the light squares, he's forced to come back, but after the rook to a1, he's just lost, he's just kaput. And so realizes how deep in the suit Vishy Anand is, he priced queen to h6. This is trying something to checkmate on the black's camp. For that, if black plays rook to a1, this position seems like normal in checkmating white in this position. White has rook to c8 in this position, deflecting the bishop. So after, let's say, bishop takes on c8, queen to g6 check, pawn can't take because the bishop here is pinning it down. This position will be somewhat devastating for black, and this position probably has some chances to draw and some chances to checkmate as well. And so none of that nonsense from Mickey Adam. He plays bishop to h3, and that puts the nail in the coffin. There's nothing that white can do. Can't place king to f3 or king moving one of that squares. And that is one of the most awkward losses from Viswanathan Anand, just because he plays a blunder of bishop to c4, thinking that he can actually exchange most of the pieces and call a draw. He just didn't expect that queen to d1 might come as a surprise. The next game is played in the 2015 Bilbao Masters. Vishy Anand playing black in this position seems to be fine after lashing out few move theory until knight to f3, where he seems to be a little bit confused. Anand did choose to go for something simple, and that is knight takes e4, but this guarantees an easier play for white after castle and knight takes on e5. The thing is, after the pawn takes, bishop takes on e4, and as you can see, white has double bishop pair. Most importantly, white has one of the pieces already developed attacking the king. While look at black's smaller pieces, they're all back ranked, and this is probably not ideal for the Grandmasters game anyway. In this position, Viswanathan Anand plays bishop to e6, somewhat odd move because after bishop to a3 attacking the rook here on f8, the rook really has to move or else it's just going to lose in exchange. You might have noticed that it's bishop to c4, but then after, let's say, bishop to f8 and bishop to f1, well, first of all, there is first bishop takes on g7, and after king to g7, queen to g4 check, picking up the bishop can come later. And as you can see in this position, it is going to be white who is more active once again. Black's pieces are all stuck on the first rank right now. And to add the position, the pawn structure from black's position is just kaput. This is split. and yeah, it's just going to be very difficult to defend. So the structure ain't nice, so the rook has to move. The rook moves to e8, but here comes queen to b1. That threatens bishop takes on h7, and also the queen taking on b7. And so bishop to e6 was a blunder. In hindsight, perhaps he could have played something like f5, kicking the bishop back to g2, kicking the bishop back to c2, for example, as d3 is impossible because it's just literally hanging. Other than that, perhaps moving the rook preemptively, because bishop a3 is coming, is also possible. Defending the pawn, playing pawn f5 next is also possible. There's always this kind of options, yeah. Queen to c2, there's always h6. This probably could have been fine for black. Instead, plays a mistake in this position and plays bishop to e6, in the face of developing the pieces. But then, it just falls to a very nasty sequence of move of bishop to a3, attacking the rook, and then queen to b1. Now, normally you defend one of the threat, right? Either you play something pawn to b6 first in this position. You play pawn to h6 is also very fine. Although in this case, pawn to h6 I think is just a blunder because queen takes b7. The knight has to move and then bishop takes on c6. This seems like a fantastic position. So for me personally, perhaps I'll play something pawn to b6, losing the pawn on h7. But it's okay, after king to, let's say, h8, I can play pawn to g6, king g7 next move, play rook to h8. Some counterplay like that. It's just still worse for black, of course, but it's a thing. It's a counterplay, right? In this position though, Anand chose to ignore both of those threats, plays queen to d2. Queen takes on d2 more precisely, and this is actually a blunder. First of all, it sends the queen down to the pits of hell, where the rook is, going to constantly threat her. But secondly, it does not really address the threat of, the pawn that is hanging on b7 and h7. Queen takes on b7 is played by Giri after the knight move because it's forced, or else the rook will be lost on a8. Giri plays bishop takes on c6. This is a fantastic position anyway for white, but in addition, is that the queen here is probably going to be trapped when my rook gets into the game. Anand chose to play rook e to b8 first, attacking the queen, but then, yeah, this is actually useless. He's never going to trap the queen. The queen is nicely protecting the bishop, but also protecting the first rank over here, so it's nice. And so after rook to d1, Anand just chose to take the rook with the queen, sacrificing the queen, essentially. But in hindsight as well, black could have chose to, let's say, move the queen somewhere. Yeah, it's just going to lose the piece. Maybe not the rook take, but bishop takes on d7. This would have been a fantastic position. Easy win in 17 moves by Giri. Instead, plays queen takes d1, and after rook takes on c6, queen takes a7. I don't really have to continue this position to say that, white is actually +3, sub 2 pawns in this position. White cares about the pawn on c4, the pawn on the a file, and the c file will be enough, plenty enough to push for a queen right here. And so I really don't have to be critical in this last move in this position. Just know that black's position crumbles pretty soon because his pawn structure is weak. He does not have enough pieces to create counterplay, and in this position, white simply just wins because black resigned. Now, we're not going to be very critical of the last few moves, that's not why we're here anyway. But in the end of the day, as you can see, even here, black has some option of knight takes on e5 to play something else other than pawn takes on e5. In this position, knight here can takes on f2, although in this position, after rook takes f2, I can understand why Anand doesn't like this position. The rook's just open, attacking the f file, and the same occurs after, let's say, knight to g3, pawn takes on g3, the rook's also open on the f file, so I can understand why Anand doesn't choose for this. Plays easier, pawn takes on e5, and help the opponent develop the bishop. But his most grave mistake in the game is probably to play bishop to e6, attacking the pawn on c4, completely ignoring the fact also that the pawn on b7 and h7 is hanging, and plays queen takes to d2. And so yeah, that's the second game. The third game is also what I covered in the previous video as well. In this position, white plays a very mistaken Greek gift sacrifice, thinking there's a checkmate in the end line. But after king takes h7 and queen h5, rook h3, let's say rook h3 in this position, after pawn to g6, black's just winning up a piece, and there's no checkmate. Queen h7 check, that's it. King to f8, the rook's protecting f7 square, and so there's no checkmate after all. And so in this position, perhaps he realizes there's no checkmate, plays knight to e4 first, hoping for a pass move, because let's say if black plays knight to b7 in this position, now rook h3 just basically works. Pawn to g6, firstly take the bishop on h6, and after queen to h7, You can play rook to f3 intermezzo first, attacking the queen, but that is to screen the pawn on f7. This is going to be kaput for black. But of course, black is Viswanathan Anand doesn't basically do that. He plays in this position bishop to d5. We can argue that black has a comfortable position. There's no checkmate in the back rank. Simply pawn to g6 works against queen to h8. We mentioned that. And we can just run the king to f8 and e7. The problem for black in Viswanathan Anand is he plays and flicked the move order first, plays king to f8. This is a bit too early, too premature in this position, because now white comes in the blow with a very fine tactic. He plays in this position queen to f7 check. How crazy is that move? This is not an everyday move that Viswanathan Anand will expect. And it's normal because after rook takes f7, we thought it's normal, but you know, knight takes g6 is now possible. There's nothing that can capture the knight anymore. And the king is stuck. He can't really run to e7. But after g8, it's just going to be rook to h8 checkmate. And so after queen takes on f7, simply Viswanathan Anand just resigned in this position. The last game is probably one of the more famous games that can go down in centuries, just because at this point in time, Viswanathan Anand just gotten his Grandmaster title and loses this game in mere 6 moves. Probably have heard this story already, but this is actually a pre-computer era. In this game, Zapata versus Anand plays pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and the game goes on with the Petrov. After knight takes e5, we see a very common knight to c3 in this position after knight takes e4. Now instead of the usual continuation of knight takes c3, pawn takes c3 right here, doubling the pawns, but then we have some play with bishop to e6, pawn to d5, bishop to d6 next move. Viswanathan Anand plays bishop to f5. Now this is actually a blunder. It turns out that Anand has read the bulletin for the tournament just last year. I think it's tournament NBL or something. I can't really remember. I'll link the video of the sources that I got this from down in the description below. Be sure to check that out. Awesome sources. But in essence, he read a bulletin for the tournament just last year. Believe that this is the quickest way to draw because there's one game that is played by 2 grandmasters of Larry Christensen and Tony Miles, where in fact, the game was just a pre-arranged draw. And so obviously there are blunders, but basically just ignored. This blunder will actually lead to a win for white if white plays queen to e2. We're just pinning down the knight to the king, and this will guarantee white at least a piece. There's no helping it. The queen can come to e7, unpinning. But a very simple looking like knight to d5 sends black to its coffin because of the queen to e6. Just imagine there is knight to c7. This is an ouch fork. And after, let's say, queen to e5, excuse me, that's not queen e5, queen to e5, I think that's going to be the same thing. Knight to c7, that is a check. But also for you who notice a little bit faster, the queen is hanging on e5. And so this is cool, but just want to show you that even the queen is not taken, knight takes on c7 is pretty much still ouch. Yeah, in this position, black just resigns. There's nothing that black can do in this position. He just resigns. And so imagine getting Grandmaster title just to believe some pre-arranged draw as an opening that guarantees you a draw. And so, you know, you have to be very, very careful of the opening lines that you choose, you pick, and understand it fully. I believe this is something that everybody has talked about. Yeah, so that's basically for the most awkward game that Viswanathan Anand has lost before. That's my version. Perhaps you have your own version as well. You can put that down in the comments below. Appreciate it. If you like this video as well, if you learn anything, if you find this video helpful, the moral is everybody loses in an awkward way at least once. So go pat yourself in the back and get back into the game. See you next time. Thanks for watching.